The lighthouse keeper's lunch. Once there was a lighthouse keeper called Mr. Grindling. At night time he lived in a small white cottage perched high on the cliffs. In the daytime he rowed out to his lighthouse on the rocks to clean and polish the light. Mr. Grindling was a most industrious lighthouse keeper. Come rain or shine, he tended his light. Sometimes at night, as Mr. Grindling lay sleeping in his warm bed, the ships would toot to tell him that his light was shining brightly and clearly out to sea. Each morning, while Mr. Grindling polished the light, Mrs. Grindling worked in the kitchen of the little white cottage on the cliffs, concocting a delicious lunch for him. Once she had prepared the lunch, she packed it into a special basket and clipped it onto the wire that ran from the little white cottage to the lighthouse on the rocks. But one Monday something terrible happened. Mrs. Grindling had prepared a particularly appetizing lunch. She had made a mixed seafood salad, a lighthouse sandwich, cold chicken garni, sausage and crisps, peach surprise, iced sea biscuits, drinks and assorted fruit. She put the lunch in the basket as usual and sent it down the wire. But the lunch did not arrive. It was spotted by 3 scavenging seagulls who set upon it and devoured it with great gusto. "Clear off, you varmints!" shouted Mr. Grindling, but the seagulls took not the slightest notice. That evening, Mr. and Mrs. Grindling decided on a plan to baffle the seagulls. "Tomorrow I shall tie the napkin to the basket," said Mrs. Grindling. "Of course, my dear," agreed Mr. Grindling. "A sound plan." But the seagulls still got the food. On Tuesday evening, Mr. and Mrs. Grindling rocked their brains for another plan. "They are a brazen lot, those seagulls," said Mr. Grindling. "Brazen indeed," said Mr. Grindling. "What shall we do?" "Our cat does not appear to like seagulls," said Mrs. Grindling. "No, my dear," said Mr. Grindling. "Hamish is an accomplished seagull chaser." "Of course," explained Mrs. Grindling. "Tomorrow Hamish can guard the lunch." "A most ingenious plan," agreed Mr. Grindling. Hamish did not think that this plan was ingenious at all. He spat and hissed as Mrs. Grindling secured him in the basket. There, Hamish," said Mrs. Grindling consolingly. "I'll have a tasty piece of herring waiting for you when you arrive home." Sadly, Flying did not agree with Hamish. His fur stood on end when the basket swayed, his whiskers drooped when he peered down on the wet blue sea, and he felt much too sick even to notice the seagulls, let alone scare them away from the lunch. "Lackaday, lackaday," said Mr. Grindling sadly. "Meow, meow," agreed Hamish pitifully. On Wednesday evening, Mr. and Mrs. Grindling racked their brains again for a new plan. "What shall we do?" said Mr. Grindling. Mrs. Grindling looked thoughtful. "I have it," she exclaimed. "Just the mixture for hungry seagulls." "Indeed, my dear," said Mr. Grindling. "What have you in mind?" "Wait and see," said Mrs. Grindling. "Just wait and see." "Mustard sandwiches," chuckled Mr. Grindling. "A truly superb plan, my dear. Truly superb." On Thursday morning, Mrs. Grindling carefully packed the mustard sandwiches and sent them off down the wire to the expectant seagulls. "Yuck! Ack! On Friday, Mrs. Grindling repeated the mustard mixture. So on Saturday, up in the little white cottage on the cliffs, a jubilant Mrs. Grindling put away the mustard pot before she prepared a scrumptious lunch for Mr. Grindling. While he waited for his lunch down in the lighthouse on the rocks, Mr. Grindling sang snatches of old sea shanties as he surveyed the coastline through his telescope. And this is what he saw. Ah, well, such is life, mused Mr. Grinling, as he sat down to enjoy a leisurely lunch in the warm sunshine. The end.
Quiz time! What did the seagulls do at the end? They ate someone else's lunch. What was their second plan? They put a cat in the basket. has